Pokémon, a pop culture Goliath which allows players to raise an assortment of adorable little monsters for training, companionship, and yes, maybe a little bit of blood sport, but it's the most wholesome blood sport you've ever seen. For over 20 years, these pocket monsters have brought endless joy to children and adults alike. But what if I told you it was built on lies? Yes, if you look a little more closely at the games, you start to notice something misleading, maybe even anti-consumer, and, dare I say, some straight up lies. These monsters don't fit in pockets at all! Well, that's where I, the Backseat developer, come in. And really, who better to put those industry professionals in their place than a YouTuber with no experience in game development? So let's crunch the numbers, get a little liberal with some Pokemon health and safety, and finally figure out if at the very least the majority of these monsters would fit in a pocket. But before we begin this very journalistic and very important work, let's go back to basics and learn where exactly the name Pokémon actually comes from. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of the Pokémon franchise. A living legend within the gaming world, and also, unfortunately, a man that the internet really struggles to accurately identify. If by some miracle you do find out information about the right person, the first thing that you'll no doubt discover is that Mr. Tajiri really loves bugs. With his less evolved child form having scooped up scores of little beasties to stuff in his pocket. But why would I bring that up? Well, because apparently this hobby is the seed that grew into what we now know as Pokémon. And a handful of years later, the first games in the series, Pocket Monsters Green and Red, were released in Japan. When the series came abroad, it adopted the snappier name Pokémon, but in Japan the name remains Pocket Monsters to this day. So that's the promise we'll be investigating. Just like Tajiri's creepy crawly collection, are these monsters really pocketable? Now you may say, of course they bloody are. The name refers to the Pokeballs being put in your pocket, not the monsters themselves. Or maybe the name refers to the Game Boy console itself fitting in your pocket, the cartridge full of monsters. Well, okay, sure, those arguments do have some weight, but when has the potential of being wrong ever stopped some good investigative journalism? To determine if the promise of Pokemon pocketability is true, we'll be investigating the original 151 Pokemon that appeared in those initial games, and gather data from their official Pokédex entries. What we won't be using is data and images from the anime, since things like size, weight, and whether you'd burn the skin right off your hands, oh my god, stop petting it, are all a little bit inconsistent and unreliable. Then, using our selected data, we'll pass the entire Generation 1 Pokédex through 3 tests. But what are those tests? The first test looks at a Pokemon's physical dimensions to determine if they would even fit inside a wearable pocket on a Pokemon trainer. To give them the best chance possible, we'll be using the largest pocket we can, which gives us a torso-bound monster receptacle measuring 49.5 centimeters tall. Now, just under 50 centimeters seems a little small. Clearly, half of all Pokemon won't fit in this. But who said the Pokemon had to be totally enveloped inside? To be classed as in the pocket, each creature only needs to have 51% or more of its body securely inside. However, any data on a Pokemon's dimensions outside of height are pretty slim pickings. Luckily, our next test will quickly weed out any beasties with, let's say, an excessive width. You would think just googling how much can an average person carry would turn up a clear answer. But using that method, it seems the average person can carry about as much as they feel like bragging about on online message boards. For example, this self-proclaimed average guy can regularly carry 100 kilograms. Well, that's a whole graveler. So let's look this guy up and ask him a few more questions about... Oh. Well then, I guess in the absence of this modern Adonis's advice, we can instead use some slightly more concrete figures, courtesy of these guidelines for what people can carry safely in the workplace. This gives us a maximum Pokémon weight of 20.5 kilograms, as a comfortable amount to carry for medium to long distances. But what if the Pokémon wasn't just unsustainable to carry because of its weight, but because you, the Pokémon, or everyone around you would die a horrible, horrible death? Now you know me, I'm a stickler for cold hard facts. And while there's been no official documentation stating developer Game Freak's policy on this, our final test will rule out any Pokémon who would perish, or cause their trainer to perish, in the act of being pocketed. For this test, we'll just imagine that each Pokémon on the list is captured and fits inside the pocket, no problem. Then we'll investigate any health risks that become apparent in that hypothetical scenario. Such risks might be if a Pokémon has a particularly dangerous innate ability that would severely injure or kill anyone in close proximity to it. Similarly, if a Pokémon has a particularly fragile body that might be destroyed if squashed into an otherwise quite comfortable cotton and spandex blend receptacle, then my lawyers tell me that's a no-go too. So those are our 3 tests for monster pocketability. But before we begin, first a few ground rules about the video as a whole. To spare you from me listing 151 Pokémon for every single test, we'll just cover the highlights and points of interest for each and save the complete data for right at the end. Then, with all this information, we'll assign a final percentage score to the accuracy of the term pocket monsters, and rank it on this: the backseat wall of gaming lies. It's a little bit empty right now, this being the first entry and all, but just try to imagine all those presumably evil game developers that are finally being brought to justice by me, a loud and smug voice on the internet. Actually, that reminds me. If you do really want to get back at those guys, send a message and set this whole rotten industry straight, there's a pretty simple solution. Give me all that reclaimed trust, clout and brand loyalty by hitting that subscribe button. I'm glad we see eye to eye on this, comrades. Well, let's get testing. There are a lot of Pokémon who are very clear candidates for early elimination using this test, including Onix, who, standing at 8.8 meters tall, is nearly 10 times too large to fit in the pocket. Bulbasaur is listed as 70 centimeters tall, but trying to slip this lad in back feet first raises a problem. The seed on Bulbasaur's back is far too bulky to be squished into the pocket. Well, at least as it currently is. In the Pokédex entry for Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald, it's stated that sunlight is what makes Bulbasaur's seed grow. So, a solution is obvious. By simply depriving Bulbasaur's seed of any sunlight, perhaps with a stylish beanie, we can ensure it stays nice, small, and pocketable. Bulbasaur passes this first test. An honour its evolutions do not. Once that bulb has blossomed, there's just no going back. On the topic of starters, Charmander easily passes, as does Squirtle. Wartortle is right on the line, measuring a meter tall, but as long as it hides inside its shell for the duration of the trip, it's good to go. More early Pokémon that prove interesting are these Buggy Boys. While both of their first 2 forms pass the test, no problem, their final forms are a little more tricky, measuring a meter high or just over. But that's the height of their entire body, including wings. Their actual bodies are rather small and easily fit under our size limit, so with just a little bit of wing folding we can snugly tuck our mandible-owning mad lads in the pocket. On the subject of folding, these thin-bodied long lads both have incredibly large heights listed. However, a Pokédex entry for Dratini in Pokémon Fire Red confirms that this describes their full body length and not their height when coiled. And this image from a Pokémon art book also confirms the same thing. Meaning at 2 meters long, Ekans is actually closer to a real-life large snake and not whatever this is. And Dratini is even smaller still. So with just a little bit of coiling completed, it's in the pocket with both of you. Some Pokémon on all fours like Nidorino would easily pass this test or be an edge case if you just looked at the numbers. But given their bulky bodies and the fact that these are their heights at their most horizontal, this Pokémon and those like it easily fail the test of size. For some height confusion that actually works in a Pokemon's favour, look no further than the official heights, including things that really shouldn't count as height, such as large floppy ears or antennae. How do you measure something that doesn't have a physical body? Haunter is listed as a gas Pokemon and can easily slip through anything it wants, including, obviously, condensing itself into the pocket. Official height be damned. Fellow Ghost Ghastly is a little more complicated, with its body only being 95% gas. But that's great too, as it gives us clear dimensions for its physical core, which by this math measures a tiny 6.5 centimeters in diameter. While Gengar, well, that entirely depends on if he's non-corporeal or has a physical body, something that we'll come back to a bit more later. Similarly compressible to the ghosts is Porygon, who, while measuring below our maximum height, is another horizontal hombre, meaning an awkward fit for the pocket. But never fear, Porygon is capable of reverting itself entirely back to program data, so we can just stick this one on a USB stick and be done with it, problem solved. Another rearrangeable chap is Grimer, who stands at 90 centimeters tall, but being made of sludge and being described as having a body that can be forced anywhere, I'm sure it can make the most of every crevice of the pocket and more comfortably pass this test than you would assume. Some Pokemon require a substance to be added to the pocket, which obviously adds a little bit of size needed. Fish like Goldeen need some water, of which there's plenty of space in the pocket, and Diglett needs some soil. Now, while Diglett's size is one of the great mysteries of Pokemon, its 20cm size above the surface, as well as the results from some of our other tests, really lean towards there not being much more under the mud after all. The final test subject we'll talk about is Kangaskhan. While it measures an enormous 2.2 meters tall, I spy with my little eye a Kangaskhan with a pre-existing taste for pockets that is maybe a little bit smaller. So with a little bit of kidnapping, done for science of course, we have another Pokemon confirmed pocketable. And that's the end. With the test of size complete, how many Pokemon have already been eliminated from the pack of 151? Well, that's a secret for now. First, let's wrap up the rest of the tests. And if you thought the solution to Kangaskhan was a little bit heavy, wait till you see these lads. Much like the test of height, there are a few Pokemon that very clearly fail this test too, including the heaviest Gen 1 Pokemon, Snorlax, who fails with flying colours weighing over 20 times our trainer's carrying capacity. But despite what you might think, height and weight aren't just two ways to test the same thing. There are some surprising discrepancies which are caught by this test, such as Dragonair, who despite being 4 meters long and far too large for the pocket to handle, easily passes the weight test at a lightweight 16.5 kilograms. Another monster weighing far less than expected is Weeping Bell, which, despite being a meter tall and only just passing the first test, weighs a ridiculously light 6.4 kilograms. A trend that carries on to its most evolved form, Victory Bell, who also easily passes the test of weight, despite being an enormous 1.7 meters tall. Grimer weighs 30 kilograms, well over our limit. However, much like the test of size, its fluid body comes to the rescue once again. As Grimer moves, it sheds body mass, meaning all we need to do is order this noxious little puddle to do a few laps around the house before we set off, and we can whittle down its body weight to an acceptable amount. Despite bizarrely weighing the same as Grimer, its evolved form Muck has no Pokédex entries that mention this ability to shed weight, preventing it from also passing this test. Some Pokemon have the ability to levitate, making this test a float in the park, essentially negating all weight they might have had. Alakazam is a bit of an edge case in this regard, as while it isn't seen floating, it's actually constantly moving and lifting its body with its psychokinetic powers, which comes to its natural conclusion with Mega Alakazam, who levitates like nobody's watching. Therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume that with a little effort, Vanilla Alakazam could at least offset about half of its weight this way to get under our limit. The ghost Pokemon Ghastly and Haunter are listed with very small weights, presumably because of their intangibility. Gengar, however, is listed with a beefy 40.5 kilograms body weight, and due to no Pokédex entries mentioning his ability to fly or slip through objects, again, the anime doesn't count, it has to be a fail on both counts for our friendly neighbourhood Gengar. Next up is Mr. Mime, who weighs an incredible 54.5 kilograms. Surely there's no way for us to get out of this corner and find a way to pocket him regardless. I mean, yeah, okay, obviously there is. But that all depends on whether something Mr. Mime mimes actually becomes tangible and able to affect the real world. Well, what's the verdict? Oh, looks like we've got something that's under contention, with contradicting answers from official sources. Well, luckily, ambiguity is where my BS thrives, so let's get stuck in. In Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire's Pokédex, it states that Mr. Mime does have the ability to magic invisible objects into existence, saying that once a witness believes they are real, they become real. Pokémon Gold goes even further, removing the need for someone to believe anything, simply stating that Mr. Mimes have the ability to create invisible objects. Well, those seem pretty clear to me, and that would mean our plan succeeds. However, in Pokémon Yellow, the Pokédex states that Mr. Mime makes enemies believe something exists when it really doesn't, which is the complete opposite. Several other Pokédex entries also seem to limit Mr. Mime's abilities to just hardening air molecules to create invisible walls. Only, not objects. It really could go either way, but as I'm a benevolent content creator, we'll decide that Mr. Mime can create helium balloons, a drone, or anything else that might help it offset some body weight and pass this test. Game Freak, hit me up for the details on where to send my bribe. Finally, we've got Staryu, who appears to be much too heavy to fit in the pocket. But since when has that stopped us? A glance at its Pokédex entries reveals that we can simply just chop it into tiny little bits, chuck most of it in the bin, and just pocket its nice, compact centre. Another problem solved with violence. Oh right, yes, I should probably explain myself, huh? Before I'm thrown in the chokey, let's clear up this Staryu situation real quick. Of course I wouldn't chop a Pokemon to bits unless it really deserved it. Oh no, sorry, it wouldn't harm it. Staryu's regeneration ability is covered more in Pokemon Ultra Moon, where it's revealed that not only does this action not bother Staryu, never mind actually hurt it, but it can also grow back its body within just 12 hours. So it's all above board, nothing incriminating here. Unfortunately, Starmie's Pokédex entries don't mention this ability at all, so to be absolutely safe, let's not chop this one up, or any of the others for that matter. But for some, being put in the pocket at all is just as deadly. Earlier we folded our butterfly friend's wings in order to squeeze its smaller main body inside the pocket, but just how much punishment can a butterfly's wings take? To find out, I got in touch with a butterfly expert on Twitter with a totally non-suspicious question and got a very clear, please don't fold a butterfly's wings. So, for Butterfree to pass the test of size, it has to fail the test of safety, as does Beedrill, who received the same treatment. However, the vast majority of Pokemon who fail this test aren't at risk themselves. Rather, it's the trainer who more frequently meets an unfortunate end. For example, these 10 Pokemon constantly excrete some kind of toxin or poison from their bodies, with effects including paralysis and suffocation. Coughing, however, has an even more deadly habit of exploding without any warning when placed in a hot environment, like, for example, some kind of hypothetical large pocket. Voltorb and Electrode are just as dangerous for this very reason, and taking them for a hike through the wilderness all but guarantees our trainer will make it to the next town in a couple hundred pieces, and most importantly, with no Pokemon in what's left of the pocket. There are a few Pokemon with body temperatures over 1000 degrees, so not something you'd like to keep pressed against your chest. And we also get the return of our buddy Gengar, who you absolutely don't want hugging your body for extended periods of time, as its very presence sucks 10 degrees of temperature from its immediate surroundings, far more than the shift in someone's core body temperature needed to develop hypothermia. Similarly, this pair of Pokémon can't help but harm their trainer when pressed against their chest, this time by accidental poison sting, with Tentacruel's evolution Tentacruel actually passing this test due to its retractable stingers that its smaller brethren hasn't developed yet. Remember how we said we would count every Pokémon as captured earlier? Well, that was so we wouldn't have to assume any hostility for this test. Well, these Pokémon all laugh in the face of that rule, and are described as causing severe harm or death to anyone and everyone for little to no reason. Well, okay, maybe the adult Kangaskhan has a little bit of a reason since we made a trainer steal its child and put it in a big pocket. But failing this one test is a worthwhile trade-off for passing the previous two, regardless of a little mauling. Despite what all that might make you think, it's not all failure and misery. The ultimate edgelord Mewtwo would appear to be catastrophically dangerous to carry around like a wee baby kangaroo, but unlike Pokemon in the previous section, it's only described as brutally attacking foes or enemies, making a captured Mewtwo presumably harmless. Similarly, all the legendary birds are described as having complete control over their elemental powers, and aren't at risk of accidentally discharging their abilities on their trainer. This lot all give off passive elemental forces that are so weak and borderline harmless to humans that their effects are limited to things like earaches, your hair standing on end, or worst of all, slight warmth. And finally, there are a few who do have elemental effects strong enough to cause harm, but with an easy fix. Are you rightfully worried that Charmander's tail might set your clothes on fire? Well, just stick that lad in the pocket upside down. And him too. Ponyta also seems to be covered in dangerous fire, but these flames actually become harmless if you've gained a close enough bond, meaning this equine endeavour is pocket ready as far as safety is concerned. Last but not least, our favourite mascot and its elder sibling are both described as being dangerous if they build up enough electric charge, something that constantly bouncing in a fabric pocket is certainly at risk of doing. However, by an equal mix of chance and my complete genius, our stretchy material of choice, cotton and spandex, holds a relatively low static charge, meaning these mousy mates are good to go. With that, all three tests have come to a close, and it's time, at last, to look over our findings. I thought we'd never make it! We're finally here! It's time for some backseat game development. So let's find out how many of the original 151 Pokémon have achieved pocketable status, and much more importantly, reveal how much of the initial promise of pocketable monsters is a big dirty lie. Well, we've got all the data, so let's get judging. Where better to begin than with the worst offenders that fly in the face of pocketability, as demonstrated by them failing every single one of the three tests put to them. But how many of these so-called pocket monsters fall into this shameful category? Well then, that's honestly fairly low. And that might surprise you, given the sheer amount of large and scary looking Pokémon in the game. However, a trend that seemed to occur a lot was that the larger a Pokémon was, or the more evolved one was, they also became more intelligent and had more control over their abilities, meaning most of the otherwise unpocketable Pokémon were at the very least harmless to be around. These 7 are the obvious exceptions to that rule, where their evolutions resulted in an amplification of their dangerous traits, such as Muck or Gengar. The only non-evolved member of this group is Magmar, who, quite frankly, was just too large and on fire right out of the gate. So, with such a low number of Pokémon failing all 3 tests, Game Freak is actually looking in pretty good shape to have at least half of their Pokémon actually be pocketable. But before we celebrate too much, let's move on to the next batch and look at the Pokémon who failed any 2 of the 3 tests. But how many Pokémon is that? Ouch! The leading cause of failure in this batch is the expected one, Pokémon who are just too big and heavy to carry around in the pocket. with 55 of these 66 failures missing the cut by failing the test of size and the test of weight as very much a 2-for-1 deal. Now, you're all smart people, and no doubt you have incredible math skills if you watched some of my previous videos, so I'm sure you're aware that this result puts Game Freak and the Pokémon series on some very thin ice. With 7 Pokémon failing every single test, and 66 Pokémon failing 2 tests, this means we're only 3 more failures away from the entire series being declared one big sham, and angry fans across the world no doubt burning their cartridges in the street in protest. But there is still hope. With the previous results, we already weeded out a lot of the obvious failures, and the chance of a Pokémon failing just one test and not the others is quite slim. Well, there's no time like the present to find out if that's actually the case, and reveal how many, if any, Pokémon failed just one of our tests, missing out on pocketable status by a whisker. Well, I'm very disappointed in the lot of you. When it comes to why these guys failed a test, the results are actually pretty varied. There are plenty of small, perfectly pocketable mons with a nasty habit of poisoning people, a lot who are just way heavier than you'd think, and a few lanky fellas who just aren't capable of becoming compact enough to fit in the pocket despite their lightweight bodies. And of course there's Kangaskhan, whose baby helped us pass the first 2 tests before the mother murdered someone, failing the 3rd. So, where does this result leave us? And how many of the so-called pocket monsters are actually pocketable? Here they are, the only Pokémon we can trust. Making an appearance here we have our 3 starters, a bunch of early area Pokémon, and thankfully series mascot Pikachu has made the cut as well. Other than that, it's a whole lot of starting evolutions with a very rare second form squeezing their way into the pocket of our hearts. But you know who isn't in our hearts? Game Freak. And by feeding all this data into my iPhone's calculator, I can reveal that Pokémon Pocket Monsters is 65.6% lies. So if you're rightfully furious, but need to know exactly how outraged to feel, the answer is around 2/3. So there we have it. Another developer kept in check by an ever-virtuous YouTuber. No doubt they'll think twice before naming an other series something like that. Oh yeah, of course, this is a whole series of video games, isn't it? Now, I was quite thorough in this video, but let's just check to see if they added any more Pokémon since the original game, and I'll just mop them up real quick. Actually, you know what really can't be trusted? The internet. Thanks for watching this episode of Backseat Game Development. I make a habit of answering questions that nobody asked, so if you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and stick around? I also have a Twitter, @BackseatGameDev, of dubious entertainment value. Thanks once again, and I'll see you next time.